Hello and welcome to the training video for candidate nominations for the 2022 national election. The Papua New Guinea Electoral Commission has prepared this training video to support the provincial returning officers, or any other authorized persons to conduct candidate nominations and perform their roles in an impartial, diligent and effective manner. This training video will also inform intending candidates about the nominations process. This chapter will provide information about candidate nomination procedures and timelines. Firstly, intending candidates can nominate after the issue of the writ. This means they can submit their nomination from 4 p.m. Thursday, 12 May 2022. Nominations will open at that time and will close 7 days later on Thursday, 19th May 2022, also at 4 p.m. Nominations can only be made in person either to the Office of the Provincial Returning Officer, PRO, for the electorate for which the election is to be held, which is the provincial seat, the Office of the Returning Officer, RO, for the electorate for which the election is to be held, which is the open seat. Offices of the Provincial Returning Officers and returning officers will be open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. daily during the nomination period. Nominations can be accepted on Sunday. However, nominations cannot be accepted after the close of the nomination period, and returning officers and provincial returning officers must pay particular attention to this deadline. A nomination cannot be accepted if it is submitted after 4 p.m. on the 19th of May. In some circumstances, the Electoral Commissioner may authorize additional people to accept nominations, and this is done via Form 24. Let's now talk about what intending candidates must submit to nominate. The first form is Form 29, Candidate Information. This form captures the personal particulars of candidates and should be provided to the PNG Electoral Commission prior to the nomination period, but can also be provided at the time Form 23 is submitted during the nomination period. The second is Form 23. Nomination of candidate for election as Member of National Parliament. This is the nomination form. The nomination fee is 1,000 kina. The nomination fee must be paid via cash or banker's cheque to a Bank of the South Pacific BSP branch. Please check the Candidate Information Toolkit for the account name and number. After payment has been made, intending candidates must submit an original official receipt of payment of the nomination fee. In addition, intending candidates must submit 4 quality passport-size photos. They must have a plain background, endorsed on the back with the candidate's name, and if endorsed by a political party, the party affiliation. Failure to supply a photograph is not a ground for rejecting a nomination, but it means that a photo of the candidate will not appear on the candidate poster for the national election. Intending candidates who are endorsed by a political party must ensure the political party endorsement section of Form 23 is completed, which includes signature by the public officer of the political party endorsing the candidate. Any intending candidate who is endorsed by a party must also submit Form 30, Political Party Information. Form 30 can be submitted before the nomination period or at the time the intending candidate submits Form 23 during the nomination period. Candidates who are not endorsed by a party will be listed as independent on the candidate poster. A photo of the party leader may appear on the candidate poster alongside the affiliated candidate. The party leader's photo is provided by the party to the PNG Electoral Commission headquarters. Additionally, intending candidates must bring 1 witness when completing the nomination process. An appropriate witness is a person who knows the person nominating. The witness must sign at the relevant section on Form 23. It is important that intending candidates and their supporters follow the COVID-19 Nupla Pasim protocols that are in effect at the time of nominations. Let's now review how to perform an administrative review of an intending candidate's nomination. After an intending candidate has submitted his or her nomination documents, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer performs an administrative check to make sure the nomination meets the administrative requirements for the nomination. At this point, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer only performs an administrative review. The substantive review on candidates' eligibility will be done after. In order to perform the administrative check, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer completes the following steps. Checks that Form 29, Candidate Information Form, is submitted, completed and signed. Checks that Form 23, Nomination of Candidate for Election as Member of National Parliament, is completed and signed. Confirms that the intending candidate has paid the candidate nomination fee of 1,000 kina, and this is evidenced by the bank receipt. Confirms that the intending candidate submitted 4 quality passport-size photos with plain background, and that the candidate's name and party affiliation, if relevant, are written on the back of each photo. If the intending candidate is party affiliated, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer ensures that Form 30 has been submitted, completed and signed. The party information is verified for accuracy with Form 23. Lastly, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer must also ensure that the candidate has brought a witness who attends at the time of nomination and signs at the respective field of Form 23. The Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer must also ensure that they sign Form 23, acknowledging receipt of the form. If, after the review of the administrative requirements, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer determines that the administrative requirements have been met, they check the enrolment status of the intending candidate. If the administrative requirements were not completed or contain formal defects, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer immediately notifies the intending candidate and invites him or her to make the correction. Formal defects refer to minor defects or errors in a nomination that do not relate to the eligibility for nomination, such as misspelling of a name, inaccurate description of any person or place, or failure to provide candidate photo. The Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer sends a notification to the intending candidates and requires that he or she addresses the defect within the deadline of 4 p.m. on the 19th of May 2022. If the intending candidate corrects the formal defect, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer receives and confirms the corrections made. If the intending candidate does not make a correction, the nomination may still be considered for further review. A very important reminder, failure to address a formal defect within the nominations period is not grounds to reject a nomination. If the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer is satisfied that the provisions of the law have been substantially complied with, the candidate nomination is still considered for further review. The Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer checks the enrolment status of the intending candidate through the roll lookup. The enrolment status is checked against the most updated voter roll for the 2022 national election. It is important that the roll lookup be performed because this will check if the intending candidate is enrolled in any ward across Papua New Guinea. There are 3 possible scenarios that the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer may encounter when checking the intending candidate's name in the roll lookup. 1. If the intending candidate is found to be enrolled in the electorate in which he or she intends to stand as candidate, the administrative check is considered completed, and the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer can proceed to conduct the substantive review of the nomination to check legal eligibility requirements. 2. If the intending candidate is found to be enrolled in another electorate, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer must take steps to issue a claim for enrolment form, Form 11, to the intending candidate. In this circumstance, the claim for enrollment would be completed as a transfer in enrollment. After the Form 11 is approved, the form is forwarded to the Data Processing Center for data entry. The transfer of enrollment will only take place if the candidate is entitled to nominate and the nomination is accepted by the returning officer. The transfer of enrollment will be reversed if the nomination is withdrawn, they fail to be elected, or they cease to be a member after being elected. 3. If the intending candidate is not enrolled at all, his or her name cannot be found during the roll lookup, and the provincial returning officer or returning officer must take steps to issue a Form 11 to the intending candidate to complete as a new enrollment. After the Form 11 is approved, the form is forwarded to the Data Processing Center for data entry. It is important to note that the nominations must be submitted earlier if the intending candidate is not already enrolled. A non-enrolled intending candidate must nominate with the returning officer or provincial returning officer for the relevant electorate within 5 days after the start of the nomination period. This means that nominations from intending candidates not currently enrolled must be submitted by 4 p.m. on 17th of May 2022. The intending candidate does not need to be enrolled in the electorate at the time of submitting their nomination. However, they must meet the enrollment eligibility criteria so that they can be placed on the electoral roll for the electorate they have nominated for. Let's look at how to perform a substantive review of the nomination. During the substantive review, the provincial returning officer or returning officer checks if the intending candidate meets the eligibility or qualification criteria provided by Constitution, electoral laws, and regulations. The provincial returning officer or returning officer checks the declarations made by the candidate on Form 23 and 29 and other documents provided to ensure that the candidate meets the eligibility criteria. No person is qualified to be elected as a member of the National Parliament unless he or she has been duly nominated. To be validly nominated, intending candidates must meet the following qualifications. They must 1. Be a citizen of Papua New Guinea. 2. Be 25 years of age or older on the date of nomination. And 3. Meet residence criteria. There are 3 options for residency, and an intending candidate must meet at least one of these. A. Born in the electorate they wish to nominate for, or B. Have lived in the electorate for which they wish to nominate for in the last 2 years immediately before their nomination, or C. Have lived in the electorate for a total of 5 years at any time. Intending candidates must also 4. Pay a nomination fee of 1,000 kina. 5. Have the right to vote or run as a candidate under the Constitution. 6. Not have dual citizenship of another country. 7. Not be of unsound mind. 8. Not be under sentence of death or for imprisonment of more than 9 months unless an appeal is pending. 9. Not have been convicted of an indictable offence after the 25th of June 2002. 10. Not have been convicted under the organic law or under the electoral regulation where the penalty imposed includes ineligibility to hold elective office. 11. Not be disqualified for election to public office because of dismissal from office under the Leadership Code in the last 3 years. 12. Not have been convicted in the previous 3 years of a prescribed offence relating to elections. 13. Not to be insolvent. There is no requirement under legal framework for a nominating candidate to be of a particular fitness or to have academic qualifications. Nominating candidates must also declare they are eligible against these qualifications and consent to act if elected on Form 23. If this declaration has not been made on Form 23, it can be made in another way. The returning officer or provincial returning officer considered satisfactory and must be made before the end of the nominations period. It is important to note that any false statements may be subject to penalties under the law. Intending candidates who are unsure are encouraged to seek their own legal advice. If after the review of the eligibility criteria, the provincial returning officer or returning officer is satisfied that the provisions of the law have been substantially complied with, the nomination can be accepted. However, if during the substantive review the provincial returning officer or returning officer determines that a nomination contains substantive errors that relate to the qualification criteria, also known as fatal defects, or if they consider that the intending candidate's eligibility is questionable, then they forward the intending candidate's nomination to the Electoral Commissioner for further review. Examples of potential fatal defects include: there's evidence that the intending candidate does not meet the eligibility criteria, or the intending candidate did not declare on Form 23 that he or she is qualified under the laws of Papua New Guinea to be elected and consents to act, or there is an objection by a third party supported by evidence that the intending candidate does not meet the eligibility criteria, or the intending candidate failed to pay or provide evidence for payment of the candidate nomination fee. Returning officers and provincial returning officers are not authorized to reject nominations. Any questionable nominations must be referred to the Electoral Commissioner for decision. The Electoral Commissioner considers the nomination and makes the decision to either accept the candidate nomination or reject the candidate nomination. If a nomination is rejected by the Electoral Commissioner, the Electoral Commissioner then notifies the Provincial Returning Officer, who notifies the relevant returning officer if applicable, and they notify the intending candidate of the decision. Public servants and ward members are eligible to contest for a seat in the National Parliament if they meet the candidate eligibility criteria under the Constitution, organic law, and electoral regulations. An intending candidate's nomination cannot be rejected based on the sole ground that he or she is a public servant or ward member who has not resigned in accordance with administrative rules if he or she has all the qualifications and none of the disqualifications. It is important to note that a candidate can only nominate for one electorate at a time. If a candidate wants to change the electorate they have nominated for, they can do so during the nomination period, but only if they withdraw the first nomination. To do this, they must withdraw a former nomination by submitting to the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer for the Electorate Form 26, withdrawal by candidate of consent to nomination. This must be done before submitting a second nomination for another electorate. Form 26 must be signed in the presence of the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer or other persons authorized by the PNG Electoral Commission to accept nominations. A copy of the signed form will be given to the candidate as proof of withdrawal. A nomination cannot be withdrawn after the nomination period has ended. Where a second nomination is received without the first being withdrawn, the nomination received first is valid as per the law. Let us now review the process of declaring nominations, steps for conducting the candidate draw, and the administrative and quality assurance steps until the preparation of the candidate poster. At some time before the close of nominations, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer will inform the public and candidates of the date, time, and place for the declaration of nominations. At the close of nominations, the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer declares the name, address, and occupation of all candidates nominated using Form 42, Declaration of Nominations. If only one nomination is received for an electorate, the candidate is automatically elected unopposed. The Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer publicly declares the nomination at the close of nominations using Form 46, Public Notice. Uncontested election, and the Returning Officer informs the Provincial Returning Officer, who then notifies the PNG Electoral Commission headquarters. If more than one nomination is received for an electorate, Then the Provincial Returning Officer or Returning Officer begins preparations to conduct the draw for positions of names on the candidate poster after close of nominations. To conduct the draw, the Returning Officer or Provincial Returning Officer invites candidates and the public to attend the place of nomination, which is usually their office. They then notify the public and candidates about the date, time and place of the candidate draw. The Returning Officer and Provincial Returning Officer also invite an officer or unaffiliated person from the community to assist in the draw. The candidate whose name is drawn out first will have their name placed at the top left of the candidate poster, and they will be allocated the number 10. This will be followed by the second, third, and so on until the order of all names is determined. There are a number of steps that must be followed to conduct the draw. From Form 42, the Returning Officer or Provincial Returning Officer writes the names of all candidates on separate slips of paper. The Returning Officer or Provincial Returning Officer folds each slip of paper to hide the name of the candidate on it. The Returning Officer or Provincial Returning Officer encloses each slip in each blank envelope of exact similarity. They then deposit all envelopes in the locked ballot box. The Returning Officer or Provincial Returning Officer thoroughly shakes the box and then opens the ballot box and removes the lid. The Returning Officer or Provincial Returning Officer chooses an officer or unaffiliated person from the community to take out an envelope and open the envelope, working one envelope at a time. They then place the names in order drawn on Form 47. The Returning Officer or Provincial Returning Officer makes the completed Form 47 available for the public and sends PNG Electoral Commission Headquarters the completed Form 47. At the conclusion of the draw, the Returning Officer or Provincial Returning Officer immediately notifies the election manager by telephone, followed by electronic advice of the order of the draw for the electorate. It is essential that the names of candidates included on any communication or publicity are spelled exactly as they appear on the nomination form. Election managers, provincial returning officers and returning officers ensure that the original copies of all candidate nomination forms are forwarded to the Electoral Commission by registered mail immediately. Once the materials are received, the PNG Electoral Commission Headquarters checks the materials received, performs quality checks of the materials received, and coordinates with provincial returning officers or returning officers in case any corrections are needed, such as correction in candidate information details, missing data fields, or any other omissions in the documentation. After performing the quality checks, the PNG Electoral Commission prepares the candidate posters and dispatches the candidate posters to the provinces and electorates for distribution to candidates, and to be displayed inside voting compartments during polling. Your role in administering the candidate nomination process is critical for the integrity and credibility of the election. Please view this training video as many times as needed in order to be informed how to exercise your role in an impartial, professional, and diligent manner. Also, please review the Candidate Nominations Manual for provincial returning officers and returning officers, and reach out to the election manager or PNG Electoral Commission Headquarters for any questions.